Right. And that's where this mystery lies, is like we don't have gospels yet, but we do have a network of
Yes,
assemblies.
groups.
So
Yep.
it's like, what are they believe in? What are they thinking about? And I think a lot of times I've run into this piece of the puzzle that I think people aren't talking about is there's these Hypsisterians,
Hmm.
Greek monotheists. And I wonder if that network was already there. And then someone like Jesus comes along. But then once you start thinking about that, you're like, well, then why are we waiting so long till Josephus and Tacitus to even hear about him in any of the sources? It's just it's a mystery. It is.
Yes, these groups of devotees of Theos Hypsistos are really quite interesting. We find them mostly in Thrace, in Macedonia, some in Asia Minor, and a few in Greece. There's a couple that show up in other parts, but especially around the north shore of the Black Sea, there's lots and lots of them. I've got a doctoral student who's working, among other things, on Theos Hypsistos groups, and the this is one of these interesting examples where we know that there are many groups. We know their names. We know we've got membership lists. We know who belong to them, uh, but we don't know much about what they believed. I mean, it would be nice to have a document like a gospel from one of these groups that told us exactly what what they think Theos Hypsistos is about. Uh, that said, though, there's still some really interesting features about these Hypsisterian groups. They tend not to offer iconic representations of the deity. Sometimes all that's indicated is an eagle, um, or a star on their inscription. So rather than actually giving us a picture of what Theos Hypsistos is like, we get aniconic representations. That has invited, for some scholars, think that there may be some kind of connection with Jewish groups, because, of course, the Septuagint calls God, among other things, Hypsistos, the Most High. Um, now, I don't think that there's enough of the connections between the Theos Hypsistos inscriptions that we have and Jewish inscriptions to say it's the same, or even that one has influenced the other. Hypsistos is simply a nice epithet that is the Most High, um, or the best. And there's certainly a tendency in the Hellenistic period, when you name your god, to attach a superlative to it. So um, Jupiter is called Optimus. That is the best, the biggest and the best. And we have other groups that use similar superlatives, including words like Hypsistos, to describe their deity. So I don't think the fact that the Hypsisterians and Jews use the same term necessarily creates a connection. However, it's quite interesting that many of the Hypsisterian inscriptions do not seem to have been produced in professional workshops. Uh, they're they're more of the line of an inscription that is cut by someone who basically is literate but doesn't really know the techniques of how you produce a beautiful calligraphic kind of inscription. So that suggests groups that are lower on the economic scale. They also tend to be gender inclusive, uh, and inclusive uh, of persons of a variety of social ranks or social registers. There's a very interesting inscription from Verroia. It's in northern Greece, where a number of the members of this group are identified as artisans, um, nail makers, and things like that. And there's others who probably are slaves, and there's at least two who are Roman citizens. Um, that's that kind of complexion of a group starts to look a little bit like what we would imagine, say, the Corinthian group to consist of. Some persons who perhaps have Roman citizenship, others who are artisans. There's certainly slaves in the Corinthian group. Um, So what's I'm not suggesting that there's a genetic relationship between Hypsisterian groups and Christ groups, but there's some interesting parallels that might suggest that these groups might, in some ways, have looked the same
Yeah.
in terms of their complexion. But as I said at the beginning, it would be really nice to know what the Hypsisterians actually believed, what kind of rituals they engaged in, and we don't know much about that at all.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with this Roman inscription from 139 BCE about the Jews getting kicked out of Rome for attempting to infect. I'm reading a Wikipedia right now. Infect the Roman custom with the cult of Jupiter Sabbatios.
Yeah, yeah. See,
The reason why I bring that up is because in Phrygia, this god is really popular. This is
yeah,
also where you see these Theos Hypsistos groups located as well. Is it possible that there might be something going on here, or is this just not enough to know?
that's another one of these cases where there's not enough to know. There is a cult of Sabbatios, and uh, the word, it's the name itself with the SAB beginning
Right.
has suggested that, does this have something to do with the Shabbat?
Yeah.
Well, that's a connection that is very difficult to make in any kind of convincing way.
Yeah, because
Uh,
nobody actually says it outright. There's nobody
no, they
saying
don't.
that would
But
help.
it's an easy confusion to make, and it's not only an easy confusion for us, but you might imagine that ancient people also seeing Sabbatios might have said, "Well, these are Jews,"
Good point.
because uh, the I don't think that the cult of Sabbatios is a Jewish cult, but the name certainly kind of invites a comparison or a confusion or a conflation of those two. And but what you're looking at there is um, the kind of xenophobia that one sees
Exactly.
in Rome, where foreign cults enter Rome. And there's a couple of them that were welcomed. The cult of the Great Mother was actually welcomed when she gets a temple on the Palatine Hill. Uh,
204.
but ISIS has some real trouble getting established in Rome. There's deep suspicion about the cult of ISIS because of its Egyptian origins, especially at the time of the conflict between Octavian and
Antony.
Mark Antony.
Because I think they depicted themselves as Isis and Dionysus.
Yeah, exactly right. And Octavian, later called Augustus, for political reasons, doesn't want to do that, and
Right.
so there's a problem with the reception of the cult of Isis, but it later gets embraced in Rome, and we've got temples of Isis in Pompeii. There's a nice temple of Isis, so it
Yeah.
seems to have made its way in. And Jews have the same kinds of problems. That is, uh, they're welcomed, but they run into difficulties from time to time, and exactly the same thing with Christians at the time of, say, Pliny, or maybe even Domitian, and later anything that looks foreign, that involves foreign-looking deities and odd practices, immediately comes under suspicion.
Wow, this is interesting stuff. So, the next question that people are asking is, if we establish that these Q sayings are coming from a common source of a group of sayings that somebody said, that begs the question: does that mean Jesus actually? This proves he existed. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if all we had was Q, I'd say the answer would be it certainly doesn't prove it. It doesn't exclude Jesus' existence, but uh, uh, we've got sayings of Aesop. Was Aesop a real person, or is this a fabricated person? A slave who has all this wisdom. Well, I don't know that anyone has ever tried to make a strong argument that Aesop actually existed. Um, in some sense, he becomes a name to which you attach sayings. Um, and was there a historical Aesop? And did he actually say anything? I don't know. I'm not sure how you'd make that argument.
He is considered one of the 7 sages of, is it Greece, I think, or Hellas? And I think he's on a list with other people who are historical. But
Yeah, I mean, he's not traditionally one of the 7 sages. That's
oh, okay,
but he gets added to that.
that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. Um, uh, so as I say, if all we had was Q, I think we would be basically in the same situation as we were with Aesop and a number of other persons. Now with Q, or with Jesus, our sources about Jesus come from multiple, we think, independent sources. So Mark and Q, I think, are independent of one another. They both talk about Jesus. Paul, even though he doesn't say very much about Jesus' sayings, there's no reason not to think that Paul thinks that Jesus was a real person. He puts a lot of stake in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the death certainly means that he was a real person. Then we have the Gospel of Thomas, and we have a couple of other sources as well. So when you get several independent sources, all of which belong to, let's say, the 1st century, talking about a person, I think it's a relatively safe bet to think that that person existed. An analogy to this would be Socrates. We don't just have Plato's word for Socrates. We have a negative portrait of Socrates in Aristophanes' The Clouds, and we've got Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is all about Socrates. So you've got 3 different ancient reporters who talk about Socrates as a real person. And I don't know that we have any classic scholars or scholars of ancient philosophy who doubt that Socrates existed. Now, that doesn't mean that the sayings that are attributed to Socrates are what Socrates said. So it's pretty clear that Plato might have some Socratic sayings, but he's taken Socrates way beyond what the historical Socrates probably said. Aristophanes makes fun of Socrates, so you get a kind of polemical representation of him. And Xenophon is more a follower who gives a record of some of the things that Socrates said. But with both Socrates and Jesus, we're in the situation of having multiple sources that don't always agree with one another, and one then has to do some filtering to sort out which likely go back to the historical Socrates or the historical Jesus. But as I say, I think our situation with Jesus is not very different from that with Socrates. I think it's not a reasonable thing to doubt that Jesus existed, given the number of ancient documents that take for granted that he exists. But that it's a very different question whether we actually know what we know about, or what we think we know about what he said. That's a different matter entirely, because you've got disagreements,
yeah,
and some serious disagreements.
yeah. That's a good point. But so, would it make sense then for people to write sayings, and then these sayings end up being in common throughout these sources if someone just made this all up? That somebody wrote some sayings that aren't really attributed to anybody in particular. They're like a collection of sayings from different people over time, and they put it into one place and then made it into a person, and then those sayings got. Is that like, which one do you think is more likely?
Well, I think both are probable. The early work that I did on Q, which came out as the formation of Q, um, tried to locate Q in the context of ancient sayings collections, and of which we've got lots. Proverbs, Sirach are 2 of the Jewish collections, but we've got Anak Shoshank and Amenemope from Egypt, and Merikare. We've got a number of Babylonian collections. Sentences of Aesop are the same. We've got a number of Greek and Latin collections, basically wise sayings attributed to various wise persons. And what I noticed when I started working through this hundreds of collections is that they all they typically all are connected to a person. Um, that is, it seemed to be in the genre of sayings collections that you couldn't just have an anonymous collection of sayings. There was a very strong tendency to attach them to a name. Now, that, of course, doesn't mean that the name to which they're attached is a reliable name. Um, I mean, we've got various versions of the sayings of the seven sages. They're different sayings, but they're all connected to the same sages. Now, I think theoretically, one might propose that there was originally a set of anonymous sayings, wise sayings, and since the tendency of the genre is to seek a name, that the name Jesus or the name John the Baptist or Jesus and John the Baptist eventually got attached to these because no one really knew who they came from. But sayings have, they sort of seek an author or seek a speaker. That's possible. And as I say, one might propose even the same thing for the collection, the Aesop collection, that there's series of sort of wise sayings, and at some point in the transmission of those sayings, somebody decides we really need a speaker for this, and let's invent this character called Aesop. Or maybe there is somebody named Aesop who, it's just a name, and they attach it. I think that's possible, but it's equally possible that that the collection of sayings preserve a memory, some kind of memory that Jesus actually said some of them, and then the collection gets created by the kind of accretion of other sayings to a core of sayings that actually do go back to Jesus. I think an argument could be made in both directions, and there's almost no way for us to decide which is the more probable.
Good point. Yeah, good answer. I just thought of this too. This is just an extra side thing, is that when you get people like Celsus in the 2nd century who are hostile, you don't hear them ever saying this didn't happen. It's always, in fact, you get traditions that are strange about his father being a Roman soldier named Pantera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any thoughts on that before I go to the next question?
Yeah, that's right. It's certainly Celsus thinks that Jesus existed. Now, he thinks he was a magician, thinks that he learned his craft. Basically, he learned the kind of deception that he thinks Egyptian magicians typically practice. So he doesn't doubt that Jesus existed. He just despises his credentials as somebody that's actually worth listening to. And certainly not worth revering as a deity or as a holy person.